This is Guy Burgess. For this post, we wanted to explore a concept we call the adaptation challenge. And it emerges from the discussion of ecodynamics that we talked about in the last post. And really what we're trying to get at here is how does one survive and prosper in a contentious, complex social ecosystem? And part of the key is you work within the system. Ecosystems don't care. You can't change the system, so you have to figure out how to work within it. You also have to be clear on your goal. For me, the goal is simply a future that we can be proud to leave our children and their children. Now, adaptation is the driver of evolution. The basic dynamic is adapt or face a life of stress and maybe deselection. And adaptation is different in the biological context and the social context. In the biological context, adaptation is based on mutation largely. It's a slow trial and error kind of process, which is one of the reasons why the rapid changes that human society is making to the planet may be so absolutely devastating for the biosphere. Social adaptation, on the other hand, is purposeful and learning-based. In the realm of technological adaptation, that is the development of tools and that sort of thing, it's really quite fast. It's based on individual learning, and in a sense, it's a complicated kind of approach. Cultural adaptation, on the other hand, is much slower. It's based on cultural traditions that have a way of going back centuries, and they move very slowly since they're based on group learning. Cultural lag is a really important concept. When I was an undergraduate student, my professor told me that most of the commencement speeches being given in the country were cultural lag speeches about how society was changing and cultural traditions needed to catch up. And that was in the 60s and 70s. Now changes are happening a lot faster, and the cultural lag is honestly getting longer. So we've got four key concepts here. Change. As conditions change, the behaviors that contribute to the success or even survival of individuals, communities, and species start to break down. Adaptation is the process of reducing stress by changing behaviors so that they're better suited to the changed environment. Adaptation lag is the stressful and dangerous time between the change and the response, which sometimes never comes. And maladaptation is the level of mismatch between behaviors and conditions. That is, you're maladapted to the environment. And then there's this notion of accumulating maladaptation. Lengthy lags can produce maladaptation by preventing successful adaptation, by definition. But failure to adapt can accumulate through a sequence of changes. While you're failing to adapt to the preceding change, there can be another change that requires even more adaptation. And the result can be accumulating stress and this notion of accumulating maladaptation, or another way of saying it is things are getting worse and worse and worse. And then there are the effects of accelerating change. The rates of change are exponentially increasing in lots and lots of different areas of human experience. And this is dramatically increasing the number of required adaptations. And this is going to result in, again, this notion of accumulating maladaptation if the lags aren't correspondingly reduced. And the danger, of course, is widespread tragedies of the common, something we've talked about in an earlier post. So how do we get into this fix? Well, it goes back to the evolutionary advantages that people have. One is the ability to think beyond the here and now, imagine and then pursue alternative futures. There's, of course, the physical dexterity to make and use tools, the mental ability to design those tools, the language skills, speaking, writing, printing, and now electronic communication to extend ideas over time and space, and then the social coordination of mutually beneficial communities that work together. But all of this has produced just stunning changes in the history of the planet. When I was in graduate school, I plotted a chart showing world population hitting 3 billion people Since then, and I'm not that old, it's hit 7 billion people. And that, as much as anything, gives you a sense of how rapidly the world's changing. Another way of visualizing this is a stunning statistic from this Scientific American article. Global CO2 production from the burning of fossil fuels is now equivalent to a gigantic forest fire the size of Africa, and this includes forests all over the Sahara Desert, plus 40% every year. And think about the impact that that's having on the environment and the planet that we all depend on. And then there's the explosion of knowledge. Human society has, and we got into this last time, it's characterized by the rise of new genetics, the notion of learning-based information as opposed to genetically based information. And the ascent of man is a story of all of that up until, maybe the late 80s. And this chart shows the explosion of information just from 1986 to 2007, and it's obviously exploded well beyond that. And here, part of the driver are things like Moore's law, and there are a lot of different similar trajectories for other kinds of information technology, but this is an exponential scale in computing power, and the power of a processor, or the transistor count, and they're roughly corresponding, has increased from 23,000 to over 23 billion. So that's 1,000,000 times more powerful over the last 4 decades. Another thing that's driving all of this is global integration. It used to be that there were lots of different ecosystems scattered around different parts of the planet. Some could flourish and others could not, and you'd have a lot of parallel evolution. We've got the world so interconnected that that's starting to break down. Now, I recommend looking at both of these animations, which you could get from the website. One is a movie of all of the ships moving around the planet, and the second is an animated graphic of trade. And you can see how tightly integrated we are and how dependent we are on things happening on the other side of the planet. Another thing that's driving all of this is what you might call the disruption culture. You have lots of organizations where the big goal seems to be come up with something new, something so new it disrupts the way things were done before. And it renders existing norms of behavior and the social contract in some important way as obsolete. And another thing worth doing sometime is going on to Wikipedia and look at the history of the companies that made up the Dow Jones 30 industrial averages. And you'll get a sense of how giant corporations can all of a sudden go poof and new ones can come out of nowhere. At one level, this is what we call creative destruction, but the social lags, cultural lags that this precipitates raise a question of whether it's maybe just destruction. You also have distributional impacts of these changes in terms of the real income, and associated with that is the real welfare of the human population. This is a stunning chart showing changes in income around the globe by percentile. And you can see that the poorest, roughly 70% of the population, have done really well over the last couple of decades, 1988 to 2008, with sort of average increases around 60, 70%. That's a stunning achievement in terms of the reduction in global poverty. But you also see in the wealthier, this is the sort of developed working class in the 70 to 90, 95% range, and their incomes have really stagnated. And this is producing lots of stress. The one thing this chart doesn't show is the stunning growth of the income of the 1% and even the 1% of the 1%. You can also see distributional impacts in this chart, which plots productivity growth and working class wages. And you can see up till about 1975, they went up together. After that, wages stagnated while productivity went up, and the difference was largely and the increasing wealth went largely to the very, very rich. And that's producing intensifying class tensions. And this is another set of changes. It's not just environmental changes, but it's changes in the way in which society allocates its resources that produce tensions that can erupt into terrible destructive conflicts between the haves and the have-nots, and then there's sort of the super haves, the tyrant wannabes. But what you're seeing is a breakdown in the social contract. It used to be that the rising tide lifted all boats, and now, as that preceding chart showed you, that's not the case anymore. And this raises all sorts of questions. So we have an adaptation crisis, I think. And there are a lot of dystopian consequences that could result from this failure to adapt to changing and very difficult conditions. On the one hand, you might have an overshoot and collapse scenario, similar to what we talked about earlier with the limits to growth. This is the specter of sort of civilization collapse, as we saw with the Chaco Culture, which made it a whole lot longer than we've made it. And the truth of the matter is there is absolutely nothing that is preventing modern culture from collapsing, or absolutely nothing that says it couldn't happen to us. There's also another dystopian future that could come out of failure to adapt to changing conditions, and this is a new kind of tyranny, sort of a George Orwell's 1984 updated to 2024 technology. Another scary prospect is anocracy, or failed states. It could be that we start fighting over all of these issues, and our inability to adapt has us so out of sync with conditions that things just quit functioning. And you have fragile states that turn into failed states. And already there are a lot of these, and they could easily become much more widespread. And even if we avoid all of these things, there's another dystopia of a society that just fails to meet basic human needs and the quality of life, again, that we are passing on to our grandchildren. It's not the sort of thing that we'd like to live in or like them to live in. So solutions exist to these problems, but only if we can move fast enough and adapt fast enough. And this requires something that you might call an adaptation accelerator. And one of the things that we're going to start thinking about is how can we do a better job of anticipating changes and responding. We need to think a lot more moves ahead. And one of the challenges is that we have to do this as a collective group in kind of a giant town meeting. We don't have the luxury of a command and control system where some benevolent, all-powerful leader tells us what to do and we do it and everything works out. This is going to require some semblance of a very, very large-scale consensus building process. And that's what we're going to try to focus on, is how can we realistically do this and how close can we realistically get? And that's going to be what we focus on for the rest of the seminar.